High in the forgotten stretches of the Montana wilderness, a 12-year-old boy named Eli Hunter had survived where no child should, and his only companion, a German shepherd with a silver-gray coat and eyes like autumn fire. He had been alone for 3 winters since the morning his mother drove away down a dirt road, promising to return with supplies that never came. The first months were filled with hunger and confusion until the dog appeared one morning in the snow, ribs showing, tail low, and somehow knew the boy needed him more than food. Together they learned the rhythm of survival, building a fragile shelter of branches and tarps, scavenging for roots, berries, and small game. Everything Eli knew about the wild came from worn library books he had once borrowed in town, their lessons etched into memory by firelight. Now, as another cold season approached, the shelter sagged and the forest grew silent with warning. Timber pressed close, his warmth steady against the chill, and Eli could feel the weight of another winter gathering over them. He marked another day on a strip of bark, whispering to the dog that they would endure one more season, though even he no longer believed it. When dawn came pale and thin through the trees, boy and dog rose together once more, 2 forgotten souls bound by loyalty and the stubborn will to keep living in a world that had long since turned its back on them. The morning brought the first snow of the season, silent and relentless in its cold beauty. Eli awoke to find his breath visible inside their shelter, the temperature having plummeted overnight as winter announced its arrival without mercy. Beside him, Timber's warm body provided the only real heat, the dog's thick fur frosted where his breath had condensed and frozen. With fingers numbed by cold, Eli reached for his most prized possession, a pencil stub he'd found months ago, and the back of a weathered flyer that had blown into their camp. As Timber watched with curious amber eyes, the boy began to sketch, his movements slow at first, then gaining confidence as the image in his mind transferred to paper. The drawing was crude but clear, showing the basic structure of a real building, a simple rectangular design with walls, a pitched roof, a door, and windows. It wasn't elaborate or fancy, just practical, designed for a single purpose, to keep its inhabitants alive. For 3 years, Eli had merely reacted, patching their shelter just enough to survive another day, another storm, another season. But as he looked at his drawing, then at the deteriorating branches and tarps that had barely protected them, something shifted within him. A new determination hardened in his eyes, visible even to Timber, who raised his head and watched the change come over his young master. This wouldn't be just another patch job, another desperate measure to survive until spring. This would be something permanent, something real, a home built from the things others had thrown away, just as he himself had been discarded. The decision crystallized, giving him a purpose beyond mere survival for the first time since being abandoned. He would build something that would outlast the winter, outlast the storms, perhaps even outlast his own pain. Timber nudged his hand as if sensing the magnitude of this decision, and Eli buried his fingers in the dog's thick gray and white fur, drawing strength from the one creature who had never left him. "We're going to build a real house, Timber," he whispered, his voice cracking from disuse. "A place where no one can hurt us again." The idea was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. He had no construction experience, no proper tools, and only his 12-year-old body to provide the necessary labor. But the alternative was another winter of suffering, perhaps even death if their current shelter failed during a severe storm. The memory of last January's blizzard was still vivid, how he and Timber had huddled together as their shelter partially collapsed, snow piling directly on their bodies as they struggled to stay warm. They had survived by mere inches that night. As he folded the paper and tucked it carefully into his pocket, Eli felt a strange new sensation spreading through his chest. It wasn't the familiar weight of fear or loneliness, but something lighter, more powerful. It took him a moment to recognize it as hope, an emotion he had nearly forgotten during his years alone in the wilderness. With renewed purpose, he rose from his sleeping mat, Timber immediately at attention beside him. Together they would begin this journey, 2 abandoned souls creating something permanent in a world that had proven tragically impermanent. The learning curve knowledge became Eli's most valuable currency as the harsh Montana winter settled over the mountains. Each trip to the dump site yielded not just materials but information, as Eli discovered discarded how-to books and home improvement magazines among the refuse. These he collected with more excitement than even the best building materials, carefully protecting them from the elements as he transported them back to their temporary shelter. Night after night, by the flickering light of a salvaged camping lantern, the boy studied basic construction techniques, while Timber lay beside him, the dog's body heat more reliable than the small fire that struggled against the bitter cold. The books revealed a world of knowledge Eli had never imagined, filled with terms like load-bearing walls, roof pitch, vapor barriers, and foundation footings. His first attempts at construction failed miserably, collapsing under their own weight or refusing to stand square. A wall section he spent days assembling fell apart when he tried to raise it. A frame meant to hold a window twisted beyond use. Foundation blocks sank unevenly into the soft forest soil. Each failure brought frustration and sometimes tears, but never surrender. Timber seemed to understand the importance of their mission, dutifully dragging smaller materials through the forest when Eli fashioned a crude harness for him and standing guard during their increasingly frequent visits to the dump site. The dog's acute senses provided early warning of approaching hikers or vehicles, allowing them to remain undetected in their scavenging. Slowly, painfully, Eli's understanding grew. He learned to compensate for warped lumber, to recognize which discarded materials still had structural integrity, to see potential in items others had deemed worthless. His hands, once soft and small, grew calloused and capable. Each blister, each splinter, each failure became a lesson, another piece of knowledge that couldn't be taken from him. On particularly difficult days, when nothing seemed to work and the cold seeped into his bones, Timber would press against him, the dog's unwavering loyalty, a reminder that he wasn't building just for himself, but for both of them. Two survivors who refused to surrender to abandonment. The learning process was as much emotional as it was practical, teaching Eli patience he'd never needed before. Simple tasks described in a few sentences in his salvaged books often took days of trial and error to execute properly in the real world. He discovered that construction required not just knowledge but judgment, the ability to adapt techniques to available materials and overcome unexpected challenges. One particularly frustrating afternoon, after a carefully constructed corner joint collapsed for the third time, Eli sat in the snow and cried from exhaustion and disappointment. Timber immediately pressed against him, licking the tears from his face until the boy couldn't help but laugh at the dog's concerned expression. The moment passed, and Eli returned to his task with renewed determination, studying the failed joint more carefully to understand what had gone wrong. By the weak light of the setting winter sun, he finally achieved success, the corner standing strong and true. That night, he added a new page to his growing notebook of construction techniques, documenting both his failures and his ultimate solution, creating his own reference manual for future challenges. The foundation. With the fundamental knowledge gained from his salvaged books, Eli understood that everything depended on getting the foundation right. He spent days scouting for the perfect location, finally selecting a small natural clearing near a spring that flowed even in the depths of winter. Each morning before dawn, he and Timber would make their way to the dump site, where the boy would select concrete blocks, bricks, and flat stones that still had structural integrity. Each piece had to be carried or dragged through the densely forested terrain, a journey of nearly a mile that became a brutal test of the boy's growing strength and determination. Larger blocks required multiple trips, with Eli moving them 50 yards at a time before returning for another push. Throughout this back-breaking labor, Timber remained his constant companion and protector, the German Shepherd developing an uncanny ability to alert him to approaching strangers. At the first sign of hikers or forest service vehicles, the dog would give a soft whine, ears pivoting toward the disturbance long before human ears could detect it. This warning system allowed them to remain undetected, slipping into the underbrush until danger passed. The work progressed with agonizing slowness, each day ending with Eli's hands raw and bleeding despite the crude gloves he'd fashioned from discarded fabric. He measured and re-measured, recalling the warning from his books about the catastrophic consequences of an uneven foundation. Using a salvaged level and string, He painstakingly adjusted each block and stone, sometimes removing and resetting pieces multiple times until they sat perfectly. The December cold was merciless, freezing the ground and numbing his fingers, yet he persisted through short daylight hours and occasional snowfalls. By month's end, a rectangular foundation approximately 12 by 16 feet emerged from the forest floor, each block and stone placed with care, creating a solid base that rose slightly above the surrounding terrain to prevent water infiltration. Standing back to survey his work, exhausted but proud, Eli felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a fragile emotion he almost didn't recognize: hope. Beside him, Timber sat alert, his intelligent eyes scanning their surroundings, his posture suggesting he already considered this carefully arranged collection of stones and blocks their territory, the beginning of a true home. The foundation represented far more than just physical support for the structure to come. It was a declaration of permanence, an assertion that this forgotten boy and his loyal companion deserved to exist in a world that had tried to erase them. Each precisely placed stone was an act of defiance against impermanence and neglect, a promise that what would rise from this foundation would endure. That night, as they returned to their deteriorating temporary shelter for what Eli hoped would be one of the final times, he noticed Timber looking back repeatedly at their building site, as if reluctant to leave their creation even for the night. The German Shepherd's behavior mirrored Eli's own feelings exactly, a growing attachment to the tangible manifestation of their future. Despite the exhaustion that made his young muscles tremble and the cold that never truly left his bones, Eli fell asleep with a sense of accomplishment that transcended mere survival, dreaming not of escape or rescue but of walls rising from the carefully crafted foundation, creating a space that was truly their own. The unexpected gift Timber's ears pricked forward, his posture suddenly alert as he stood at the edge of the dump site. Eli froze immediately, trusting the dog's senses more than his own. Instead of the usual warning growl that signaled human presence, Timber gave an inquisitive whine, his head tilted in curiosity. Following the German Shepherd's gaze across the expansive debris field, Eli spotted what had captured the dog's attention: a weathered construction trailer partially hidden behind a pile of discarded kitchen cabinets. Approaching cautiously, every sense heightened by years of necessary vigilance, Eli found the trailer's door hanging open, the lock long since broken. The interior was musty but dry, largely protected from the elements by its metal shell. What he discovered inside nearly brought him to his knees, a treasure more valuable than gold to a boy attempting to build a home from scraps. Tools. Real, professional-grade tools hung from a pegboard wall or lay scattered across built-in counters. Hammers with intact handles, hand saws still sharp enough to cut, levels with unbroken vials, screwdrivers of various sizes, pliers, wrenches, and even a manual drill with a set of bits. Tears welled in Eli's eyes as his fingers reverently touched these implements, tools that would transform his capabilities overnight. Beneath the main workbench, another discovery awaited: a comprehensive construction manual, its pages dog-eared and coffee-stained but intact, containing detailed illustrations of framing techniques, wiring basics, plumbing fundamentals, and roofing methods. That night, back in their deteriorating shelter as the temperature plummeted to bitter cold, Eli read by firelight, absorbing knowledge from the manual with desperate intensity. Timber lay pressed against him, the dog's body heat fighting back the freezing air that found every gap in their temporary home. As snowflakes began to drift through the largest holes in their shelter, Eli read about proper roof construction, his mind already converting the information into plans using materials he'd seen at the dump. With each page turned by firelight, their future became a little more secure, a little more possible. The abandoned construction trailer had delivered not just tools, but knowledge and possibility. Gifts beyond measure for a boy determined to create something permanent in a world that had proven tragically impermanent. Eli carefully organized his newfound treasures, wrapping each tool in salvaged fabric to protect it from moisture and rust. The hand drill became his most prized possession, a miracle of mechanical advantage that would save countless hours of labor compared to the primitive methods he'd been employing. In the pages of the construction manual, he found answers to questions that had been tormenting him for weeks. how to properly join floor joists to the foundation, how to create a solid connection between walls and roof rafters, how to ensure adequate drainage around the foundation. The technical language was sometimes beyond his comprehension, but the detailed illustrations provided guidance his young mind could follow. As he finally drifted to sleep that night, one hand buried in Timber's thick fur for warmth, the other resting protectively on his new construction manual, Eli felt a shift in the balance of his struggle. For the first time since being abandoned, he possessed not just the will to survive, but the tools to truly build something lasting. Tomorrow would bring renewed purpose to their labor, transforming what had been a desperate experiment into something approaching real construction. The frame rises. The first vertical wall frame represented everything Eli had learned in his weeks of study and preparation. Using the construction manual as his guide, he had carefully selected the straightest lumber from the dump, boards that others had discarded but still held structural integrity when properly supported. Each nail had been painstakingly straightened, pounded back into usable condition on a flat rock he'd designated as his anvil. The work was slow and methodical, with Eli measuring twice before each cut, aware that mistakes would waste precious materials and energy. The winter sun provided little warmth as he worked, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air, but the physical exertion of hammering and sawing generated enough body heat to keep him functioning. Timber maintained a constant patrol around the perimeter of their building site, occasionally bringing smaller pieces of wood in his mouth, seeming to understand their purpose in creating this shelter. When Eli cut himself badly on a rusty saw while trimming a stubborn board, the German Shepherd refused to continue his patrol, instead lying directly beside the boy, occasionally licking his hand until the bleeding stopped and the crude bandage was secured. With the first wall frame complete, Eli faced the challenge of raising it alone. The structure was heavy, too much for his thin arms to lift in one motion. Drawing on techniques from his manual, he rigged a temporary brace from smaller lumber scraps, allowing him to walk the wall upright inch by inch until it stood vertical. Securing it temporarily with diagonal supports, he immediately began work on the second wall. The winter days were short, limiting his productive hours, yet the frame steadily took shape, a skeleton of something permanent rising from the wilderness. Each evening, as darkness forced him to stop, Eli would sit with Timber at their original shelter, his sore muscles and cut hands testifying to the day's efforts, and watch the silhouette of their emerging home against the twilight sky. The structure represented more than just physical shelter. It was defiance against abandonment, a declaration that this boy and his dog refused to disappear. Each board nailed into place was an argument against the impermanence that had defined Eli's young life, a statement that something lasting could be built even from what others had discarded, much like the bond between the abandoned boy and the loyal dog who had found him. The work demanded everything Eli had to give, testing the limits of his endurance and ingenuity. When a crucial piece of lumber proved too warped for its intended purpose, he spent hours steaming it over boiling water, gradually coaxing it toward straightness, a technique gleaned from his precious construction manual. The corners of the structure gave him particular trouble, requiring perfectly square connections that his inexperienced hands struggled to achieve. After multiple failures, he developed a template system using salvaged plywood scraps that allowed him to maintain consistency across the frame. The discovery of a box of rusted but still functional metal corner braces at the dump site felt like divine intervention, providing strength where his amateur joinery might have failed. As the four walls rose, connected and braced according to the diagrams in his manual, Eli felt a growing sense of ownership and pride that transcended his young age. Each evening, before retreating to their temporary shelter, he and Timber would walk the perimeter of their creation, the boy inspecting his day's work, while the German Shepherd marked the territory as their own, two beings claiming their rightful place in a world that had forgotten them. The watcher in the woods, Timber's behavior changed suddenly, one crisp morning as Eli worked on securing rafters for the roof structure. The dog, usually content to patrol their perimeter with relaxed vigilance, became tense and hyper-alert, his ears constantly swiveling to catch sounds from the surrounding forest, his nose testing the air with nervous intensity. At first, Eli attributed the behavior to passing wildlife, perhaps a deer or elk moving through their territory. But as days passed, the boy began to notice other troubling signs. Small items around their building site appeared slightly moved from where he had carefully placed them. A hammer that should have been hanging from a nail on the frame was lying on the ground. A stack of reclaimed shingles had been subtly rearranged. Most alarming were the footprints, adult-sized impressions in the soft earth circling the structure, appearing overnight and definitely not matching Eli's own smaller tracks. Someone was watching them, studying their creation with unknown intent. Fear, a companion Eli thought he had mastered during his years alone, returned with paralyzing force. Had authorities discovered him? Was it someone from the resort community investigating the missing materials? Or something worse, someone with malicious intent drawn to the evidence of vulnerability in the wilderness? The boy's hard-earned routine shattered under this invisible threat. He began working only during the most extreme hours, rising before dawn to hammer and saw in the gray half-light, then retreating with timber into the forest during midday, where they would find concealed positions that offered views of their construction site. For hours, they would sit in absolute stillness, the boy and his dog watching their creation from a distance, scanning for any movement that might reveal their observer. Timber would lie beside him during these vigils, occasionally issuing a nearly silent growl when his superior senses detected something Eli could not yet perceive. The house, which had represented security and permanence, now felt exposed and dangerous, a beacon announcing their presence to an increasingly threatening world. Yet, despite the fear, Eli refused to abandon his project. Instead, he adapted, becoming more cautious, working in shorter bursts, developing backup plans for quick escapes, and relying more heavily on Timber's acute senses to provide warning. The Watcher remained unseen but ever present, a shadow that transformed their construction from an act of hope into something more complex and dangerous. Eli began sleeping with a salvaged kitchen knife beside him, its blade kept sharp by regular honing against a smooth river stone. He created hidden caches of essential supplies throughout the surrounding forest, ensuring they could survive if forced to abandon their home suddenly. The footprints continued to appear with disturbing regularity, sometimes circling the entire structure, other times approaching within inches of the doorframe Eli had installed. On a particularly tense afternoon, Timber refused to leave the partially completed house, even to follow Eli back to their temporary shelter, standing his ground with hackles raised, growling at something invisible among the trees. That night, Eli made the decision to abandon their original shelter and move permanently into the unfinished structure, despite its lack of proper insulation or completed roof. They needed to protect what they had built, to establish their presence as a deterrent against whatever lurked in the shadows. The boy and his dog would stand their ground, facing this unseen observer with the same determination that had kept them alive for 3 lonely years. The winter's assault, the brutal blizzard struck without warning, transforming the peaceful forest into a howling maelstrom of white. Eli had been racing against time, trying to complete enough of the roof to make the structure weather-tight, but winter had outpaced his efforts. As the first heavy flakes began to fall, he and Timber retreated into the partially finished house. The only option, as their original shelter had already been dismantled for salvageable materials. The walls stood complete, the roof structure in place, but large gaps remained where proper sheathing and shingles should have been, covered only by salvaged tops hastily secured with whatever fasteners Eli could find. As darkness fell, the storm intensified, snow accumulating at an alarming rate, while fierce winds probed every weakness in the structure. Cold air knifed through gaps between boards, finding every mistake in Eli's amateur construction, while snow sifted through the makeshift roof covering, forming small piles on the plywood subflooring. Throughout the night, the boy worked frantically by lantern light, stuffing gaps with scraps of insulation, repositioning tarps, and adding additional bracing where the wind threatened to tear away his hard work. Timber stayed close, his body heat the only reliable warmth as the temperature plummeted well below freezing. The dog's presence was both practical survival and emotional comfort, his solid weight leaning against Eli whenever the boy paused in exhaustion, his occasional soft whines communicating concern when the wind's howl reached particularly threatening levels. By morning, they had survived, but barely. Eli, hollow-eyed from a sleepless night of desperate repairs, surveyed the damage as weak daylight filtered through the snow-covered tops. The structure had held, a testament to the fundamental soundness of his design and construction, but the storm had ruthlessly exposed every shortcoming, every compromise forced by limited materials and knowledge. Snowdrifts had formed inside corners where walls met imperfectly, and moisture threatened the untreated wood in several critical areas. The blizzard had delivered a harsh but valuable lesson about the urgency of their task and the unforgiving nature of mountain winters. Timber shook the snow from his thick coat and pressed against Eli's leg, his steady presence a reminder that they faced these challenges together, the boy and his dog against the elements. With renewed determination born from this brush with disaster, Eli mentally revised his construction priorities. The luxury of taking his time had vanished with the storm. Now it was a race for survival. The most critical need was a proper roof, one that could withstand the weight of accumulated snow and prevent wind-driven precipitation from penetrating the interior. Using techniques adapted from his construction manual, Eli created a steeper pitch than originally planned, allowing snow to slide off rather than accumulate. He abandoned his careful organization of salvaged materials, digging frantically through the snow-covered dump site for anything that could serve as adequate roofing. What he found was a treasure beyond expectation. Several bundles of asphalt shingles, discarded perhaps because they were an unwanted color, still wrapped in their original packaging and protected from the elements. Over the next 3 days, working from sunrise to sunset despite numbing cold, Eli completed the roof, meticulously following the installation instructions he had memorized from his manual. Timber patrolled constantly during these vulnerable hours, his vigilance allowing the boy to focus entirely on the critical task, his occasional barks warning of approaching wildlife or deeper snowslides from the surrounding trees. The heart of the house. The day Eli installed the salvaged wood stove marked a transformation in their struggle against winter. He had discovered the small cast-iron stove half buried beneath discarded furniture at the dump site. Its surface rusted but its structure intact, a relic perhaps from some cabin renovation where the owners had upgraded to something more modern and efficient. Transporting it had required multiple trips, moving the heavy metal object 50 yards at a time, resting, then returning for another push, Timber staying faithfully by his side through the exhausting process. Installing the stove demanded meticulous attention to the detailed diagrams in his construction manual, particularly regarding safe clearances from combustible materials and proper ventilation. Using salvaged brick to create a fireproof base and platform, Eli positioned the stove in the center of the main room, where it could most efficiently radiate heat throughout the small structure. The chimney proved most challenging, requiring creativity with found materials. But after days of careful work, he had assembled a functional chimney pipe that extended properly through the roof, secured with improvised flashing to prevent leaks. The moment of lighting the first fire was filled with trepidation, the boy watching anxiously for smoke, backing up into the room or signs that his chimney design was flawed. When the flames caught properly and the smoke drew upward as intended, relief washed over him in a wave so powerful it brought tears to his eyes. The stove quickly transformed their existence, its iron surfaces radiating genuine warmth that pushed back the bitter cold for the first time in years. That night, boy and dog slept on the bare plywood floor of their creation, the orange glow from the stove's small window casting dancing shadows on the rough walls. Despite the absence of proper beds or furniture, despite the gaps still visible in the construction, despite the many tasks that remained before their house could truly be complete, they slept deeply and peacefully. Timber's soft breathing beside Eli sounded different here, no longer the vigilant, light sleep of an animal constantly alert for danger, but the deeper, more trusting rest of a creature who felt genuinely sheltered. The boy's hand rested on the dog's thick fur, his fingers occasionally twitching in dreams that, for once, weren't filled with cold and fear. The stove had given them more than physical warmth. It had transformed their crude structure into something with a heart, a core of heat and life around which a true home could form. For the first time since being abandoned, Eli felt a sense of accomplishment that transcended mere survival, a quiet pride in creating something permanent and good from the wreckage of his broken life. The wood stove became the center of their daily routine, dictating the rhythm of their existence. Each morning began with Eli carefully stoking the banked coals from the previous night, adding kindling gathered from the surrounding forest and smaller pieces of scrap lumber salvaged from the dump. Throughout the day, he would feed the fire at regular intervals, learning through experience exactly how much fuel was needed to maintain optimal temperature without wasting precious wood. In the evenings, they would gather close to the stove's radiating warmth, Eli reading his salvaged books by the light of a candle made from rendered animal fat, while Timber dozed contentedly beside him. The practical benefits of the stove extended beyond mere warmth. It provided a reliable way to dry clothing soaked during outdoor work, to purify water collected from snow or the nearby spring, and even to cook simple meals from Eli's limited food supplies. More importantly, it represented self-sufficiency, the ability to create comfort even in the harshest conditions, a physical manifestation of the resilience that had kept this boy and his dog alive when the world had forgotten them. The interior takes shape. With the exterior shell complete and the wood stove providing reliable warmth, Eli turned his attention inward, determined to transform the bare wooden box into a functional living space. Insulation became his first priority, the construction manual emphasizing its critical importance for retaining heat. Unable to find proper batting or foam board in sufficient quantities, he improvised with layers of discarded moving blankets, old clothing, and even stacks of newspapers, all carefully tucked between wall studs to create dead-air spaces. The pages of an entire encyclopedia, found waterlogged but salvageable at the dump, were dried by the stove and repurposed as wallpaper, their yellowed surfaces covering the roughest interior walls, while providing additional insulation and a touch of unexpected decoration. Furniture emerged from pallets and crates, with Eli studying the construction manual's basic joinery techniques to create crude but functional pieces. A bed frame rose from the floor, elevated on salvaged blocks to reduce cold transfer from the ground, while a simple table and chair were fashioned from carefully dismantled shipping crates, their surfaces sanded with scavenged sandpaper to remove the worst splinters. Most triumphant was the installation of a salvaged sink connected to a system of rain barrels Eli had positioned at the roof's edge to collect precious water that could be brought inside rather than carried from the spring. Timber seemed to understand the significance of each improvement, his intelligent eyes watching Eli's every move with what appeared to be admiration, his tail offering encouraging wags when particularly difficult tasks were completed successfully. The dog adapted his own habits to the evolving space, establishing a favorite spot near the stove where the heat was strongest, yet always positioning himself to maintain sight lines to the door and windows, his protective instincts undiminished by their improved circumstances. As January gave way to February, the interior continued its transformation, with small touches that went beyond mere functionality, reflecting Eli's growing confidence. A shelf appeared, holding treasured books and small objects found during foraging trips. Crude curtains made from salvaged fabric covered the windows, providing privacy and additional insulation. At night, the stove's glow illuminated a space that, while humble and clearly constructed from cast-offs, had undeniably become a home, a physical manifestation of resilience created by a boy who refused to disappear and the loyal dog who had never left his side. Each salvaged item found new purpose within these walls. A broken mirror, carefully reassembled and hung near the door, allowed Eli to monitor his increasingly wild appearance. Plastic storage containers became organization systems for his limited possessions. Discarded carpet remnants, thoroughly cleaned and dried, provided insulation for the plywood floor. The boy's ingenuity seemed boundless, fueled by necessity and the detailed illustrations in his construction manual. He created a primitive but effective ventilation system using principles of convection, ensuring fresh air circulation without excessive heat loss. A series of hooks mounted near the stove provided places to dry wet clothing and gear, while a cleverly designed shelf above the heat source allowed for food preparation and preservation. Throughout this interior transformation, Timber remained an active participant, seemingly understanding the importance of each addition. The German Shepherd would investigate new items brought into their home with cautious curiosity, sometimes carrying smaller objects in his mouth, from the construction site to the doorway, as if offering his own contributions to their evolving shelter. The close call, the spring thaw, had begun to soften the forest paths when Eli encountered his first real threat of discovery. He and Timber were returning from the dump site with a salvaged window, a double-paned unit that would replace the single glazed one currently letting too much heat escape from their bedroom area. The German Shepherd suddenly froze mid-stride, his body tensing as his ears swiveled forward, alerting Eli to danger seconds before the boy himself heard the approaching footsteps. Training born from years of necessary caution took over instantly. The window carefully lowered to the forest floor, as boy and dog slipped silently into the dense underbrush alongside the trail. They had barely concealed themselves when a forest ranger appeared around the bend, moving methodically along the path, his uniform a jarring intrusion of authority in their private wilderness. The man paused barely 10 feet from their hiding place, his experienced eyes scanning the surroundings with professional attention. Eli's heart hammered against his ribs so violently he feared the sound would betray them. Yet he remained absolutely motionless, one hand resting on Timber's back in a silent command for stillness the dog had long since learned to obey. The ranger seemed to sense something amiss, his gaze lingering on the nearby undergrowth where they hid, before crouching to examine a partial footprint in the soft earth of the trail. Too small to belong to an adult, too clearly defined to be dismissed as animal tracks. For an agonizing minute, the man remained there, radio crackling at his belt with indecipherable voices, before finally rising and continuing along the path. Only when the footsteps had faded completely did Eli dare to breathe normally again, Timber's muscles relaxing beneath his touch as the immediate danger passed. That evening, as they returned to their home by a deliberately circuitous route, Eli realized with growing dread that discovery was inevitable unless he took immediate precautions. Their very success had created vulnerability. A structure as substantial as the one they had built could not remain hidden forever in these woods, particularly as increased patrols swept the area at the beginning of hiking season. The boy worked through the night, exhaustion forgotten in the face of this new threat, meticulously camouflaging the exterior of their home with branches, native plants, and careful applications of mud that helped the wooden walls blend into the surrounding forest. He rerouted their access path, eliminating the direct trail that had begun to form from repeated use, and created several false paths leading away from their true location. Most critically, he established an emergency protocol with Timber, practicing quick, silent evacuations through a concealed rear exit, training the dog to respond instantly to specific hand signals that would allow them to communicate without sound if strangers approached. Their home, once a symbol of permanence and security, now required constant vigilance to remain their sanctuary. The ranger's near discovery had shattered Eli's fragile sense of safety, replacing it with a hyper-awareness of every sound in the forest, every shadow that moved differently than expected. He began sleeping in short bursts rather than through the night, rising frequently to check their surroundings, relying heavily on Timber's superior senses to detect potential threats. The boy understood with painful clarity that his existence was fundamentally illegal, a miner living alone in government land, stealing materials from a private dump site, building an unauthorized structure in protected wilderness. Discovery would mean not just the loss of their home, but separation from Timber, his one constant companion through years of abandonment, a possibility too devastating to contemplate. With this new understanding came heightened resolve. They would protect what they had built, adapting once again to survive in a world where even their simple existence constituted a transgression. The spring revelation. As winter released its grip on the mountain, Eli witnessed a transformation, both in the surrounding forest and in his own creation. The melting snow revealed areas of their home that required immediate attention, water damage that had occurred during winter storms, gaps in the foundation that needed sealing before the spring rains arrived in earnest. Yet the thaw also brought opportunity. Longer days filled with strengthening sunlight that illuminated new possibilities. While patching the exterior with materials from his dwindling salvage supply, Eli's gaze kept returning to the small clearing behind their home, the southern exposure now receiving hours of direct sunlight as the sun's path rose higher in the spring sky. The construction manual had a chapter on seasonal additions that included rough plans for basic decks and patios, outdoor living spaces designed to extend the functional area of a home during warmer months. Working from these diagrams, adapting them to his limited materials and skills, Eli began constructing a small, simple deck where he and Timber could sit in the strengthening sun after months of confinement indoors. He salvaged pressure-treated lumber from the dump site, material specifically designed to withstand moisture and ground contact, using his growing carpentry skills to create a stable platform elevated just inches above the forest floor. Timber seemed to understand the purpose of this new project, often lying in patches of sunlight near the construction area, his gray and white coat gleaming in the brightness as he watched Eli work. The spring thaw provided another essential resource that the boy had carefully planned for during the winter months. Using discarded plastic barrels, he constructed a rainwater collection system integrated with the roof's gutter arrangement, allowing precious rainfall to be efficiently captured and stored rather than simply running off into the surrounding soil. This water would supplement their supply from the nearby spring, providing a more convenient source for washing and eventually for the container garden Eli envisioned. The garden itself began modestly, with salvaged buckets and plastic tubs filled with the richest soil he could find in the surrounding forest, supplemented with carefully composted organic material he had collected through the winter. Seeds came from dried fruits and vegetables he occasionally found at the dump site, carefully extracted and dried by the wood stove during the coldest months, now planted according to information gleaned from a tattered gardening book in his growing library. As these spring projects took shape, the house itself underwent a subtle but significant transformation. What had begun as a desperate shelter, a mere barrier against the killing cold of winter, began to display touches of personality and purpose that transcended basic survival. Wind chimes fashioned from salvaged metal pieces hung by the newly constructed deck, their gentle tones warning of approaching weather changes while adding a touch of beauty to their home. The interior walls, once merely functional, now displayed careful decorations, pressed spring wildflowers arranged in patterns, intricate whittled figurines Eli had carved during long winter evenings, even a crude but recognizable painting of Timber, created with pigments extracted from various colored soils and berries. From the outside, their home remained nearly invisible, camouflaged to avoid detection. But within its walls and in the immediate surroundings, a true living space had emerged, a place not just of existence but of genuine life. Timber's behavior reflected this evolution, the dog now patrolling their expanded territory with confident familiarity, no longer simply surviving alongside Eli but truly dwelling with him in a home they had created together from the discarded remnants of others' excess. The unexpected guest, the sharp, urgent bark that woke Eli from deep sleep, was unlike Timber's usual warning. Instead of the low, threatening growl that signaled human intrusion, this was a higher-pitched sound of confusion and concern. Grabbing the salvaged flashlight he kept beside his bed, Eli followed Timber to the front door, where the dog stood with head tilted, ears forward, listening intently to something outside. Cautiously opening the door, Eli swept the beam across their small clearing, half expecting to see a raccoon or perhaps a fox attracted by the compost pile. What the light revealed instead froze him in place. A young deer, barely more than a fawn, lay collapsed at the edge of their clearing, its flank torn and bloody from what appeared to be a predator attack, likely a mountain lion or wolf that had been interrupted before finishing its kill. The animal's sides heaved with labored breathing, its wide eyes reflecting the flashlight beam with the unmistakable glaze of shock and terror. Eli's first instinct was to retreat, to close the door on this unfortunate but natural tragedy, yet something in the creature's desperate condition triggered a deeper response. Without conscious decision, he found himself moving forward, speaking in the same soft, reassuring tone he used when Timber was anxious. The German shepherd followed cautiously, no longer barking but maintaining a vigilant position slightly ahead of Eli, occasionally glancing back as if seeking direction in this unprecedented situation. The deer was too weak to flee, managing only a feeble attempt to rise before collapsing again, its injuries clearly severe but not immediately fatal. 3 years of wilderness survival had taught Eli basic animal first aid, necessary skills for treating Timber's occasional injuries and his own frequent wounds. From his salvaged supplies, he retrieved a rudimentary medical kit, antiseptic, clean rags, and crude bandages fashioned from boiled and dried cloth. Working slowly to avoid further stressing the injured animal, he cleaned the worst of the wounds, applied pressure to stop the bleeding, and finally wrapped the deer's flank in protective bandaging. Throughout this impromptu veterinary session, Timber remained nearby, his initial confusion gradually transforming into what appeared to be protective concern, his body positioned between the clearing's edge and the vulnerable deer, as if standing guard against the return of whatever predator had caused the initial injury. The decision to bring the deer inside came with first light, when it became clear the animal was too weak to move yet would likely die from exposure if left outside. Using a salvaged tarp as an improvised stretcher, Eli carefully maneuvered the deer into a corner of their one-room home, creating a nest of old blankets where the injured animal could lie undisturbed. For 2 remarkable weeks, the deer became an unlikely houseguest, recuperating in the corner of their home while Timber stood guard, somehow understanding this creature needed protection rather than pursuit. Eli gathered fresh greens and berries from the forest, offering them alongside dishes of clean water, watching with growing satisfaction as the young deer gradually regained strength. The animal's presence transformed their small home into something entirely unexpected, a sanctuary not just for 2 abandoned souls but for any creature in need. When the deer finally rose on strengthened legs and made its way tentatively toward the door, Eli opened it without hesitation, watching with Timber at his side as their guest paused at the forest edge, turned once to look back at them, then disappeared silently into the undergrowth. That evening, sitting on their newly completed deck as twilight softened the forest, something profound shifted within Eli. For the first time since being abandoned, he felt not just the determination to survive but the quiet satisfaction of having made the world slightly better through his own actions. Their home had become more than shelter. It was a place of healing and hope in a wilderness that could be unforgivingly cruel. The discovery. The warm afternoon had drawn Eli and Timber to work outside, expanding their small vegetable garden with newly constructed planting boxes. The boy was focused intently on mixing soil with composted material when Timber's posture suddenly changed, his body tensing as his ears swiveled toward the northern edge of their clearing. The warning growl that rumbled from the German shepherd's throat sent ice through Eli's veins. This was not the curious alert of wildlife passing nearby, but the serious alarm that signaled human presence. In one fluid motion, Eli dropped his tools and melted into the camouflaged entrance of their home, Timber following instantly, the dog's training allowing for silent, immediate response to danger. Through a small observation port Eli had built into the door specifically for surveillance, they watched as the undergrowth at the clearing's edge stirred and parted. A figure emerged, not the uniform-clad ranger Eli had feared, but something potentially more dangerous. A teenage girl, perhaps 15 or 16, wearing hiking clothes and carrying a small day pack. She moved with the casual confidence of someone who felt perfectly safe, clearly having no idea she had stumbled upon an inhabited space. Her expression shifted from curiosity to astonishment as she registered what stood before her, not just a random pile of forest debris, but a deliberately constructed dwelling, its camouflage effective at a distance, but revealing its true nature upon closer inspection. Timber's growl deepened, the sound vibrating through the floor as the intruder moved closer to their home, examining the carefully disguised walls with growing wonder. The girl called out suddenly, her voice shattering the forest silence. "Hello? Is anyone here? I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to understand what I've found." The words froze Eli in place, the first human voice addressed directly to him in nearly 2 years. Timber looked up at his master, waiting for direction in this unprecedented situation. For agonizing minutes that stretched into hours, they remained in silent standoff, the girl repeatedly calling out with increasing curiosity, occasionally circling the structure or sitting patiently on a nearby log, while Eli and Timber remained hidden inside, the boy's mind racing with potential consequences of discovery. As afternoon light began to fade and the girl showed no signs of leaving, occasionally taking photographs with her phone but making no threatening moves toward the structure, Eli reached the inescapable conclusion that this confrontation could not be avoided through simple waiting. With heart hammering against his ribs and dry mouth, he whispered a command to Timber, positioning the dog protectively between himself and the door, before slowly, cautiously pulling it open. The girl, who had been sitting on a log about 20 feet from the entrance, jumped to her feet in shock, her eyes widening as she took in the small, thin boy framed in the doorway with the large German shepherd standing guard before him. "Oh my God," she breathed, her voice barely audible. "You actually live here?" The question hung in the air between them, the first words of human conversation Eli had experienced in so long he had almost forgotten how to respond. When he finally spoke, his voice emerged as a rough whisper, rusty from disuse in anything beyond occasional, murmured words to Timber. "Yes," he said simply, one hand resting on his dog's back, ready to retreat instantly at the first sign of threat. "My name is Maya," the girl offered, remaining carefully still as she registered the dog's protective stance. "And I promise I'm not going to tell anyone about this unless you want me to. I just want to understand." The words, "unless you want me to," caught Eli's attention, offering something he hadn't dared to hope for, the possibility of discovered existence without immediate destruction. The girl's open, curious face showed no disgust or fear, only wonder and perhaps admiration, reactions so unexpected they momentarily disarmed him. After years of isolation, where Timber represented his entire social world, Eli faced the first tentative bridge back to human connection, terrifying in its unpredictability, yet compelling in ways he couldn't fully articulate even to himself. The tenuous trust. The girl called Maya returned 3 days later, approaching their clearing with deliberate noise to announce her presence rather than risk startling Timber. She carried a small backpack that she carefully set down at the edge of the clearing before stepping back, a gesture clearly intended to appear non-threatening. "I brought some things," she called, maintaining a respectful distance from the camouflage dwelling where Eli stood partially concealed in the doorway. Timber's gray form a solid barrier between them. Just basics. A proper first aid kit, some fresh fruit, and a new collar for your dog. The old one looks pretty worn. The gifts were strategically perfect, addressing practical needs while acknowledging both occupants of the unusual home. After several long minutes of silence, Eli emerged fully, signaling Timber to maintain watchful but non-aggressive posture, and approached the backpack with the caution of a wild animal accepting offered food. The first aid kit alone was worth the risk. A proper medical supply with antiseptics, antibiotics, and real bandages instead of his boiled rags and salvaged tape. The fruit represented an almost forgotten luxury, while the sturdy new collar for Timber acknowledged the dog's importance in their small family unit. Maya kept her distance during this inspection, sitting quietly on the same log she had used during her first visit, offering neither unwelcome proximity nor the pressure of constant conversation. Her patience was rewarded when Eli finally spoke, his voice still rough and hesitant from disuse with humans. "Thank you." The simple phrase bridged a chasm of isolation, opening a narrow channel of communication that would gradually widen over subsequent visits. Maya returned every few days, each time bringing small, thoughtful offerings, seeds for the garden, a book on local edible plants, a proper leash for Timber that allowed for more control during their increasingly frequent walks together. Slowly, Eli began to trust her presence, allowing her closer to their home, eventually inviting her inside to see what he had built from society's discards. Her genuine amazement at his accomplishment provided validation he hadn't known he craved. Her questions about construction techniques respecting his knowledge rather than questioning his capabilities despite his young age. Most importantly, she kept her promise of silence, telling no one about the boy and his dog living in their hand-built home deep in the forest. The relationship developed its own rhythm, with Maya sharing news from the outside world while respecting Eli's need for space and privacy. She taught him things his books couldn't: how to better seal windows with materials she smuggled from her father's workshop, how to create a more productive kitchen garden with proper seed spacing and companion planting techniques learned from her grandfather. Throughout these interactions, Timber remained a constant presence, initially positioning himself between Maya and Eli during every visit, gradually allowing her closer but always maintaining his protective vigilance. The dog's gradual acceptance of Maya became its own kind of milestone. His willingness to take treats directly from her hand or eventually to allow her to adjust his new collar, representing significant shifts in their isolated dynamic. This tenuous trust, built carefully over weeks of consistent, respectful interaction, represented Eli's first reconnection with the human world he had fled. While maintaining his independence and the security of his hidden existence, he began to experience the complexity of human connection again, rediscovering social interaction through this limited but significant bridge to the outside world. Maya never pushed for details about his past or how he came to be living alone in the forest, sensing perhaps that such questions might shatter their fragile relationship. Instead, she focused on the present, on practical improvements to his situation, and on establishing herself as a reliable ally rather than a threat to his carefully constructed life. The shadow of authority. Maya's face was unusually serious as she approached the clearing on a bright June morning, her typical cheerful greeting absent. Eli immediately sensed something was wrong, Timber's response to his tension resulting in the dog moving closer to his side, alert and watchful. "I need to tell you something important," she said without preamble, settling on their customary log with none of the relaxed ease that had developed between them. "The county is planning a major cleanup of the illegal dump site where you've been getting your materials. There's been a complaint filed by an environmental group about possible contamination of the watershed, and they're sending teams to clear everything out next month." The news alone was concerning, cutting off Eli's primary source of building materials and supplies, but what followed was far more alarming. "That's not all," Maya continued, her voice dropping slightly as if the trees themselves might carry her words to unwanted ears. "There's talk at my dad's office about increased Forest Service patrols in this whole sector. Someone reported signs of habitation in the protected wilderness area, unofficial trails, missing materials from the dump site, footprints that don't match known hiking patterns. They're specifically looking for whoever is living off the grid out here." The words fell like physical blows, each one chipping away at the security Eli had built so carefully. His home, his sanctuary, his years of work and adaptation, all of it suddenly threatened by the approaching shadow of authority. Timber sensed his distress immediately, pressing against his leg with comforting warmth as the boy struggled to process this new danger. "How much time do we have?" he finally asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Years of crisis management having taught him to focus on practical considerations first, emotional responses later. "The cleanup starts in about 3 weeks. The increased patrols are already happening, but they're still focusing on areas closer to the resort development. I'd say you have maybe 2 weeks before they start systematic sweeps of this sector." 2 weeks. The time frame echoed in Eli's mind as he surveyed everything he had built, everything he stood to lose. The fruit trees just beginning to establish themselves in the carefully prepared soil near their water collection system. The expanded garden with its promise of sustainable food sources. The weather-tight home constructed entirely from materials others had discarded, representing countless hours of labor and learning. Most importantly, the life he had created with Timber, independent and isolated but fundamentally theirs, free from the systems and institutions that had failed him when his mother disappeared. That night, unable to sleep despite exhaustion, Eli sat on their small porch with Timber's head resting heavily on his lap, the stars overhead offering no solution to the crisis facing them. They could run deeper into the wilderness, abandoning their home for even more isolated territory, but that would mean starting entirely from scratch with winter only months away. They could try to improve their camouflage, making the structure even more invisible to searching eyes. But increased patrols with trained observers made eventual discovery almost inevitable. They could abandon the mountains entirely, trying to reach a distant city where they might disappear among thousands of others. But urban survival presented its own dangers, particularly for a boy with a large German shepherd and no legal guardian. Every option seemed to lead to the same terrible end: discovery, separation from Timber, and forced return to the very systems his mother had been fleeing when she left him in these mountains. Tears he had not allowed himself in years slid silently down his face as he buried his fingers in Timber's thick fur, the dog's steady presence, the one constant in a world suddenly threatening to unravel around them, the hard truth. After days of deliberation that left him hollow-eyed from lack of sleep, Eli reached a decision that terrified him more than any physical danger he had faced in the wilderness. He would trust Maya with the full truth, hoping that genuine understanding might open possibilities he couldn't envision alone. They sat together on the small deck he had built, Timber lying vigilantly between them as afternoon sunlight filtered through the trees, creating dappled patterns on the weathered wood. "My real name is Elijah Winters," he began, his voice stronger now from weeks of regular conversation with Maya, but still carrying the hesitancy of someone unaccustomed to sharing personal history. 3 years ago, my mother and I were living in a small apartment in Billings. She had problems with drugs, prescription stuff first, then worse things. There were always men around, sometimes nice, usually not. The last one was really bad. He hurt her a lot, and started looking at me in ways that scared her more than anything else. The words came slowly at first, then in a rush, as if a dam had broken inside him, releasing a flood of memories he had carefully walled away. He described how his mother had bundled him into their ancient car late one night, driving for hours into the mountains, promising a camping trip until things cooled down. They had parked at a remote trailhead, hiking several miles into the wilderness with minimal supplies. She had helped him build a simple lean-to, promising to return the next day with more food and proper equipment. Her final words, "Be brave for me, just for a little while," had been accompanied by a tight hug that, in retrospect, held the desperation of a final goodbye. She had never returned. For days, he had maintained the small camp exactly as she left it, venturing only short distances to gather berries and water from a nearby stream. When a week passed with no sign of her, he had hiked back to the trailhead, finding the parking area empty, not just of their car but of any sign his mother had ever existed. Fear of being placed in the foster care system, of losing the one connection to his mother, her promise to return, had driven him deeper into the wilderness rather than toward civilization. The discovery of Timber, half-starved and abandoned like himself, had sealed his decision to remain hidden, creating a life outside the systems that had already failed them both. Maya listened without interruption, her expression shifting from shock to sorrow to something approaching awe, as Eli described his gradual evolution from terrified child to self-sufficient survivor. When he finally fell silent, emotionally exhausted by the recounting, she remained quiet for several moments before speaking. "If you're reported or discovered, they'll separate you from Timber," she said finally, acknowledging his greatest fear directly. "Standard procedure would place you in emergency foster care while they investigate your mother's disappearance. No foster placement would accept Timber, especially without vaccination records or formal training certification." Her straightforward assessment, neither sugar-coated nor unnecessarily harsh, confirmed Eli's worst expectations. But then she offered something unexpected. "My grandfather was a family court lawyer before he retired. He might have ideas about how to approach this without triggering the full system response. Would you be willing to meet with him if I can guarantee he won't report you immediately?" The question represented the largest leap of faith Eli had contemplated since his mother's abandonment, extending trust beyond Maya to another adult, someone with direct connections to the legal system he had been avoiding for years. Yet the alternatives seemed increasingly limited as the countdown to increased patrols continued. With Timber pressed reassuringly against his side, Eli made the second most difficult decision of his young life. "Yes, but he comes here, not somewhere else. And Timber stays with me no matter what." The conditions reflected his fundamental priorities, maintaining control of his environment and preserving his bond with the one living being who had never abandoned him. The advocate Barrett Wilson did not match any image Eli had constructed of a lawyer. The old man who carefully picked his way along the narrow forest trail behind Maya wore faded jeans, a flannel shirt that had seen better days, and hiking boots scuffed from years of use. His weathered face, crowned with a shock of white hair, bore none of the stern judgment Eli had anticipated, instead displaying open curiosity as he entered the clearing and caught his first glimpse of the structure before him. Timber stood at high alert beside Eli, neither growling nor retreating, his posture communicating watchful assessment rather than immediate threat. "Well now," Barrett said, coming to a halt at a respectful distance, his eyes taking in the carefully camouflaged dwelling with its neat proportions and ingenious adaptations. "Maya described your home, young man, but I don't think her words did it justice." There was genuine admiration in his tone, not the condescension or pity Eli had braced himself to endure. The initial meeting stretched into hours as Barrett asked thoughtful questions about the construction, examining the rainwater collection system and garden with particular interest, all while maintaining a careful physical distance that respected both Eli's boundaries and Timber's protective instincts. Only after establishing this foundation of respect did the conversation turn to legalities, with Barrett explaining plainly but not unkindly the challenges Eli's situation presented. "Standard procedure would place you immediately in emergency custody while authorities investigated your mother's disappearance," he confirmed, echoing Maya's earlier assessment. "The system is designed with certain assumptions, primarily that minors cannot safely care for themselves without adult supervision. Your remarkable self-sufficiency here challenges that assumption directly, but bureaucracies aren't built to handle exceptions, no matter how compelling." Eli listened intently, Timber's head resting heavily on his knee, the physical contact grounding him as Barrett outlined the legal realities facing them. Rather than surrendering to these challenges, however, the retired lawyer began thinking aloud about alternative approaches, his legal mind engaging with the problem as if it were a complex puzzle rather than an impossible situation. "The current standard for determining placement decisions is the best interest of the child," Barrett explained, stroking his chin thoughtfully. "Typically, this is interpreted within very conventional parameters: stable housing with adult supervision, regular school attendance, medical care, and so forth. But the fundamental principle is sound, even if its application is often narrow." His gaze swept over the small, sturdy house Eli had built from discarded materials, taking in the thriving garden, the efficient water collection system, the carefully organized interior visible through the open door. "What you've created here represents something extraordinary, a testament to human resilience and ingenuity. Tearing you away from this achievement and placing you in conventional foster care might satisfy procedural requirements, but would it truly serve your best interests? I'm not convinced it would." Hope, that most dangerous of emotions for someone who had learned to survive on pragmatic realism, flickered cautiously in Eli's chest. Barrett seemed to recognize both the structural challenges and the moral complexity of the situation, approaching it not as a simple case of returning a runaway to proper authorities, but as a genuine ethical dilemma deserving thoughtful consideration. As afternoon faded toward evening, the retired lawyer made no move to conclude their meeting or to suggest Eli leave his home. Instead, he accepted the boy's hesitant invitation to step inside, removing his boots at the threshold with the natural courtesy of a respectful guest rather than an evaluating authority. Inside, his appreciation for what Eli had accomplished became even more apparent, his experienced eyes noting the clever adaptations, the careful use of limited resources, and the fundamental soundness of the construction. "You've built something remarkable here," Barrett said finally, standing in the center of the one-room dwelling with genuine respect in his voice. "Something that deserves to be protected rather than dismantled. I can't promise miracles, but I believe there might be a path forward that keeps you and Timber together while providing the legal framework necessary to prevent the system from separating you. If you're willing to trust me to explore those possibilities, I'd like to try." The offer hung in the air between them, not a solution but the beginning of one, not a guarantee but a commitment to advocacy from someone who understood the system from the inside. Eli looked at Timber, who had gradually relaxed during Barrett's visit, eventually settling on his usual spot near the wood stove rather than maintaining high alert. The dog's acceptance seemed its own kind of endorsement, an instinctual assessment that this particular human represented more opportunity than threat. Facing Barrett directly, Eli nodded once, a simple gesture that belied the enormous leap of faith it represented for a boy who had learned through bitter experience that adults were fundamentally unreliable. "Yes," he said simply. "I'll trust you to try." The proposal. Barrett returned to the Forrest home 1 week later, his expression a mixture of excitement and caution as he settled onto one of the rough-hewn chairs Eli had crafted from salvaged lumber. Maya sat nearby on a cushion Eli had made from stuffing an old sleeping bag with dried moss, while Timber maintained his now customary position of relaxed vigilance near the door. "I've been doing some research," Barrett began, placing a folder of papers on the small table between them, "and I've discovered something unexpected about the land you've built on." Eli leaned forward, intensely aware of the significance this information might hold for their future. "According to county records, this precise location falls into what we call a gap in the property lines. Essentially, it exists in a surveying error that occurred nearly 50 years ago when the national forest boundaries were redrawn. The eastern line of the protected wilderness and the western line of what was then private property don't quite meet, creating a narrow strip of unclaimed land approximately 3 acres wide that includes your building site. This revelation was met with stunned silence, Eli struggling to process its implications. Barrett continued, his lawyer's precision making the complex situation remarkably clear. This surveying anomaly was flagged for correction decades ago but fell through bureaucratic cracks during a county reorganization. Technically, this land belongs to no one. It's not national forest, not private property, not designated wilderness. It exists in a kind of legal limbo. Hope and wariness battled in Eli's expression as Barrett outlined what this might mean for their situation. There's a legal concept called adverse possession that applies in circumstances like these. In simple terms, if someone openly occupies unclaimed land for a specific period of time, maintains it, improves it, and treats it as their own without challenge from any other party, they can eventually claim legal ownership. The required time period in this state is 5 years for most situations, but there are provisions for accelerated claims under special circumstances. Maya, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, broke her silence. "So, Eli could eventually own this land legally, without having to leave?" Barrett's response was measured, neither dismissing the possibility nor overstating it. "It's a potential long-term solution, yes, but it doesn't address our immediate challenge. Eli remains a minor who legally requires guardianship, regardless of where he lives or who owns the land." This brought the conversation to the heart of Barrett's proposal. The reason for his cautiously optimistic expression despite the complexity of their situation. "I've spent considerable time thinking about this, and I'd like to offer something unconventional. I'm willing to petition the court to become Eli's legal guardian, with specific provisions that would allow him to remain living in his home rather than relocating to my residence, provided the structure is brought up to basic safety codes and regular check-ins are established." The offer was extraordinary in its scope, representing a fundamentally different approach to guardianship than standard practice would dictate. Instead of forcing Eli into conventional living arrangements, Barrett was proposing to adapt the legal framework to accommodate the remarkable situation the boy had created for himself. "There would be conditions," he continued, his tone serious. "The house would need proper inspection and safety upgrades. You would need to receive appropriate education, either through formal enrollment in the local school or through a structured homeschooling program I would help establish. There would be regular health checks and social services visits, though I believe I could negotiate for these to be less frequent and more respectful than standard procedure would typically allow." The responsibilities Barrett was willing to assume were considerable: legal accountability for Eli's welfare, regular reporting to family court, potential liability for any issues that might arise. Yet he offered this commitment not with reluctance but with the quiet conviction of someone who recognized an opportunity to truly serve a child's best interests rather than merely following procedural requirements. Eli sat in stunned silence, processing this unexpected proposal. The possibility of remaining in his home, of keeping timber, of gaining legal recognition rather than continuing to exist as a ghost in the system, these represented outcomes he had not dared to imagine. "Why would you do this?" he finally asked, the question cutting to the core of his lingering distrust. his hard-earned skepticism about adult motivations. Barrett's answer was simple but profound, because sometimes doing what's right requires creative thinking rather than following established patterns. What you've built here deserves protection, not destruction, and every child deserves an advocate willing to fight for their actual best interests, not just bureaucratic approximations of them. In that moment, Timber rose from his position by the door and moved to sit directly beside Barrett's chair, a gesture of acceptance more eloquent than any words could have been. The renovation. The transformation began cautiously, with Barrett bringing a small group of trusted individuals to evaluate what would be needed to bring Eli's remarkable creation into compliance with basic safety standards. Maya was a constant presence, her role evolving from secret visitor to active participant in the renovation process. Barrett's two oldest friends, retired contractors with decades of experience, approached the project with professional curiosity rather than judgment, openly admiring Eli's ingenuity, while gently identifying areas that required improvement. The most critical concerns centered on electrical and structural safety. Eli's improvised wiring system using salvaged solar panels presented fire hazards despite its clever design, while certain load-bearing elements needed reinforcement to meet building codes. The plumbing system, essentially a gravity-fed network of salvaged pipes connected to the rainwater collection barrels, required modification to include proper filtration and backflow prevention. Throughout this assessment process, Timber maintained constant vigilance, gradually accepting these new human presences but always positioning himself between strangers and Eli, his protective instincts undiminished by the expanding circle of human interaction. The actual work proceeded in careful phases, with Barrett insisting that each step be explained to Eli in detail, the boys' consent and involvement treated as essential rather than optional. The retired contractors, Dave and Michael, quickly recognized Eli's remarkable aptitude for construction and adapted their approach accordingly, treating him as an apprentice rather than a child to be managed. They taught as they worked, explaining the rationale behind building codes that initially seemed arbitrary, demonstrating proper techniques that would enhance the longevity and safety of the structure. Eli absorbed this knowledge with the same intense focus he had applied to his salvaged construction manuals, his natural intelligence finding expression in rapid mastery of concepts that would challenge many adults. The solar electrical system underwent the most dramatic transformation, with Barrett investing in proper panels, an appropriate battery bank, and professionally designed wiring that eliminated fire risks while significantly increasing capacity. Dave spent 3 full days installing this system alongside Eli, patiently explaining each component's function and teaching the boy basic electrical safety principles. Meanwhile, Michael focused on structural reinforcement, adding proper supports to the roof system and additional bracing to walls where necessary, all while preserving the fundamental integrity of Eli's original design. Maya's contribution focused on interior improvements, working with Eli to enhance insulation using proper materials rather than his improvised solutions, installing actual windows in place of his salvaged frames, and creating more functional living spaces. Her design sensibilities complemented his practical approach, resulting in a home that maintained its unique character while becoming considerably more comfortable. Throughout this process, Timber's behavior evolved in fascinating ways. Initially wary of the increased human activity, the German Shepherd gradually established a hierarchy of acceptance, with Barrett and Maya earning almost complete trust, Dave and Michael receiving cautious approval, and any occasional new visitors warranting intense scrutiny. He seemed to understand that these changes represented improvement rather than threat, his territorial protectiveness extending to include these new allies rather than perceiving them as intruders. The psychological impact on Eli proved equally profound. After years of complete self-reliance, the experience of collaborative work with supportive adults represented a fundamental shift in his understanding of human relationships. The trauma of abandonment had taught him that people were fundamentally unreliable. This renovation process offered counter-evidence, examples of adults who kept promises, respected boundaries, and contributed positively without demanding control. By the project's completion, the physical transformation was remarkable. The structure remained recognizably Eli's creation, maintaining its unique character and ingenious use of salvaged materials, but with critical improvements that made it genuinely safe and sustainable. The roof, now properly sealed and insulated, would withstand Montana's harshest weather. The solar electrical system provided reliable power for lighting and basic needs. The reinforced walls and foundation ensured structural integrity for years to come. Most importantly, the home now existed in a liminal space between official recognition and continued independence, documented enough to satisfy basic legal requirements while preserving the spirit of self-determination that had defined Eli Wilderness' existence. The documentation Barrett approached the documentation process with the meticulous attention of an experienced lawyer building a case, albeit one unlike any he had handled during his long career. With Eli's reluctant permission, he began photographing every aspect of the house and surrounding property, creating a comprehensive visual record that captured both the remarkable ingenuity of the construction and the substantive improvements completed during the renovation. These images told a compelling story. Salvaged materials transformed into structurally sound walls, discarded windows repurposed with weather-tight sealing, rainwater collection systems designed with environmental sensitivity, and gardens created from what others had thrown away. Beyond the physical structure, Barrett documented Eli's systems for daily living, his methods for food preservation, his organized approach to tool storage and maintenance, his carefully kept notebooks detailing everything from local edible plants to construction techniques adapted for limited resources. This evidence of the boys' exceptional self-reliance would form the foundation of their unconventional legal strategy, challenging the standard assumption that a 12-year-old was inherently incapable of responsible independence. Parallel to this visual documentation, Barrett conducted gentle but thorough interviews with Eli, recording his story from the moment of his mother's disappearance through the discovery of timber, the building of their home, and the daily challenges of wilderness survival. These sessions often proved emotionally difficult, requiring frequent breaks when painful memories surfaced, with Timber providing constant comfort, pressing against Eli's side or resting his head on the boy's knee when distress became apparent. Throughout this process, Barrett maintained absolute transparency, explaining exactly how each piece of information would be used in their legal petition, and respecting Eli's occasional refusal to discuss certain aspects of his experiences. This approach gradually built trust, allowing Eli to share more freely as he came to understand that Barrett genuinely sought to protect rather than exploit his story. Maya contributed her own documentation, creating a detailed inventory of the skills Eli had developed during his years alone. His knowledge of local flora and fauna exceeding most adult naturalists, his practical engineering solutions rivaling those of trained professionals, his adaptive problem-solving revealing remarkable cognitive development despite the lack of formal education. Her observations, combined with Barrett's legal expertise and the contractor's professional assessments of Eli's construction capabilities, created a comprehensive portrait of a child whose circumstances were genuinely exceptional, demanding equally exceptional legal consideration. As this documentation accumulated, Barrett began formulating their legal strategy, focusing on three critical arguments. First, Eli's demonstrable self-sufficiency challenged fundamental assumptions about minor incapability that underlay standard guardianship requirements. Second, the unique legal status of the land itself provided opportunity for an unorthodox resolution, preserving both Eli's independence and necessary oversight. Third, and perhaps most compelling, the profound bond between Eli and Timber constituted a relationship that would be catastrophically damaged by standard foster placement, creating potential psychological harm that directly contradicted the best interests standard the court was obligated to uphold. The most powerful element of their documentation emerged unexpectedly during one of Barrett's visits, when Eli hesitantly shared a weathered composition book he had kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Inside were 3 years of journal entries, beginning with the day of his mother's disappearance and continuing through every significant event that followed. Written in increasingly mature handwriting and progressively complex language, these entries provided raw, unfiltered evidence of Eli's emotional and intellectual development, his struggles and triumphs, and his fears and moments of pride. With Eli's permission, Barrett carefully photographed select pages that demonstrated the boy's remarkable resilience without exposing his most private thoughts, creating a documentary record more compelling than any lawyer's argument could ever be. By the time their preparation was complete, they possessed an extraordinary portfolio: photographs, expert assessments, personal testimony, and contemporaneous documentation, all telling the story of a child who had created something remarkable from circumstances most adults would find insurmountable. This carefully assembled evidence would form the basis of their petition to the family court, challenging conventional assumptions about child welfare, while proposing a genuinely innovative approach to guardianship that might preserve rather than destroy what Eli had built. The hearing. The Flathead County Courthouse loomed before Eli, a massive stone edifice that embodied the formal authority he had avoided for 3 years. His borrowed clothes, a button-down shirt and khaki pants provided by Barrett, hung loosely on his thin frame, despite Maya's efforts to adjust them, making him appear even younger than his 12 years. Timber walked beside him, specially permitted in the courtroom through Barrett's careful legal maneuvering and a doctor's letter classifying him as an emotional support animal essential to Eli's psychological well-being. The German Shepherd's presence provided the only real comfort as they climbed the wide courthouse steps, his solid warmth against Eli's leg a steady reminder that whatever happened inside, they faced it together. The family court hearing had been deliberately scheduled for the final slot of the day, a strategic decision by Barrett to minimize public attention and provide maximum privacy for Eli's unusual case. Judge Eleanor Marsh, a veteran of the family court system known for her thoughtful approach to complex cases, had agreed to this accommodation, already signaling some receptivity to Barrett's preliminary arguments that standard procedures might not adequately address their unique situation. The courtroom itself felt overwhelming to Eli, whose entire world had contracted to forest spaces and his small home for the past 3 years. The high ceilings, formal wooden furnishings, and hushed atmosphere created a sense of institutional power that made his hands tremble slightly as he took his seat beside Barrett at the counsel table. A representative from Child Protective Services sat at the opposing table, her expression professionally neutral but her posture communicating skepticism about the unconventional arrangement Barrett was proposing. Court officials moved with practiced efficiency, organizing files and preparing recording equipment as Judge Marsh entered and the proceedings formally began. Barrett had prepared Eli extensively for this moment, explaining each step of the process and coaching him on how to address the court. Yet nothing could fully prepare him for the experience of having his life examined and evaluated by strangers wielding institutional authority. When called to testify, Eli approached the witness stand with Timber at his side, the dog's steady presence visibly calming his anxiety as he placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Judge Marsh spoke directly to him, her tone deliberately gentle, but her questions precise and probing. She asked about his daily routines, his methods for obtaining food and water, his strategies for handling medical issues or emergencies. She inquired about his education, both formal schooling before his mother's disappearance and his self-directed learning since. Most critically, she asked him to explain in his own words why he believed remaining in his forest home with Barrett as legal guardian would better serve his interests than conventional foster placement. Eli's response emerged hesitantly at first, his voice raspy from years of minimal human conversation, but gained strength as he described the home he had built, a connection to Timber that sustained him through isolation, and the profound sense of security he had created from the wreckage of abandonment. "It's the only place I've ever felt safe since my mom left," he concluded, his simple honesty more powerful than any rehearsed statement could have been. "Timber and I built it together. If I lose it, if I lose him, I'll have nothing left." The CPS representative presented standard arguments for conventional placement, citing regulations and established procedures with professional competence. She acknowledged Eli's remarkable self-sufficiency, but emphasized concerns about proper education, regular medical care, and appropriate social development. Her position, while not hostile, firmly represented the system's inherent resistance to exceptions and alternative approaches. The turning point came when Barrett presented their documentation, the photographs of Eli's construction, the professional assessments from the contractors, the careful renovation plans that had brought the dwelling up to safety codes. Most compelling were excerpts from Eli's journal, read aloud with his permission, chronicling the evolution from terrified abandoned child to resourceful builder, and his relationship with Timber providing emotional stability that no institutional placement could guarantee. This case asks us to consider what best interest of the child truly means, Barrett argued in his closing statement. Is it rigid adherence to conventional placement standards, or thoughtful adaptation to honor exceptional circumstances? Eli has created something remarkable, not just a physical structure, but a life defined by resilience, resourcefulness, and profound connection to his companion animal. Standard foster placement would destroy both. The arrangement I propose provides necessary oversight and support while respecting the extraordinary home and life this young man has built for himself. Throughout the proceedings, Timber remained a model of disciplined behavior, lying quietly at Eli's feet when stationary, walking perfectly at heel when moving, his calm demeanor making its own argument for the stabilizing influence he provided in the boy's life. As Judge Marsh announced she would take the matter under advisement and render her decision the following week, Eli buried his fingers in Timber's thick fur, drawing strength from the dog's steady presence as they faced the most significant uncertainty since their lives had intertwined 3 years before in the Montana wilderness. The decision. The week of waiting stretched into an eternity for Eli, each day a painful exercise in controlling the spiraling anxiety that threatened to overwhelm him. He spent the time at Barrett's home, a temporary arrangement agreed upon while awaiting the court's decision. Though the retired lawyer's comfortable house offered physical amenities far beyond his forest dwelling, hot running water, consistent electricity, a fully stocked refrigerator, Eli found himself longing for the simple security of the home he had built with his own hands. Timber adjusted to their temporary quarters with remarkable adaptability, quickly establishing favorite spots in Barrett's living room and backyard, while maintaining his protective vigilance over Eli. The German Shepherd's consistent presence provided the only real stability as they navigated this liminal period between their past isolation and an unknown future. Barrett maintained cautious optimism, his legal experience suggesting that Judge Marsh's willingness to consider their unconventional proposal represented a positive sign, while Maya visited daily, bringing small comforts and welcome distraction through board games and borrowed books. When the call finally came from the courthouse, scheduling their return for Judge Marsh's ruling, Eli felt an almost overwhelming urge to flee, to grab Timber and disappear back into the wilderness, rather than face a decision that might separate them forever. Only Barrett's steady reassurance and the dog's unwavering presence gave him the courage to enter the courtroom once again, his heart hammering so violently he feared others might actually hear it. Judge Marsh entered with the same formal dignity that had characterized the original hearing, her expression revealing nothing as she took her seat and arranged the documents before her. The courtroom felt even more oppressive to Eli than before, the institutional power it represented now directly connected to his future in ways he could barely process. Timber pressed against his leg beneath the table, the dog's warm solidity the only thing preventing complete panic as the judge cleared her throat and began to speak. After careful consideration of all evidence presented in this highly unusual case, I am prepared to render my decision regarding the guardianship of minor Elijah Winters, she began, her tone formal but not unkind. This court is typically guided by well-established procedures designed to protect the welfare of children who enter the system through various unfortunate circumstances. However, the foundational principle underlying all such procedures is the best interest of the child, a standard that occasionally requires us to look beyond conventional approaches when faced with truly exceptional circumstances. Eli held his breath, his hand finding Timber's fur beneath the table as Judge Marsh continued her methodical explanation. The documentation presented by Ms. Wilson provides compelling evidence that young Mr. Winters has demonstrated extraordinary self-sufficiency, resourcefulness, and maturity in creating a stable living situation following his unfortunate abandonment. The professional assessments of his dwelling, now improved to meet basic safety codes, suggest a level of capability far beyond what would typically be expected of someone his age. Most significantly, the profound bond between Mr. Winters and his canine companion represents an emotional support structure that conventional placement would almost certainly destroy. The next words changed everything. Therefore, this court grants legal guardianship of Elijah Winters to Barrett Wilson, with the following specific conditions. Mr. Winters will be permitted to continue residing in his self-constructed dwelling, which must maintain compliance with all safety codes as verified through quarterly inspections. He must receive appropriate education through enrollment in the local school district or a structured homeschooling program approved by the court. Regular medical and dental examinations will be required, with reports submitted to this court biannually. Mr. Wilson will conduct weekly in-person welfare checks and maintain daily telephone contact when not physically present. Child Protective Services will conduct monthly visits for the first year, transitioning to quarterly visits if no concerns arise. This arrangement will be subject to review in 6 months to ensure all parties are fulfilling their obligations appropriately. The formal legal language transformed into something miraculous in Eli's understanding. He could keep his home, keep timber, maintain the life he had built while gaining the protection and support that came with legal recognition. It represented an outcome so far beyond his desperate hopes that he sat in stunned silence, unable to fully process the implications as Judge Marsh concluded her ruling. This court acknowledges the unconventional nature of this arrangement and the concerns raised by Child Protective Services regarding precedent. However, I wish to emphasize that this decision is based on the genuinely exceptional circumstances presented in this specific case, including the unusual legal status of the property in question, the demonstrated capabilities of the minor involved, and most critically, the determination that preservation of his existing support structure, particularly his bond with his companion animal, truly represents his best interest as defined by statute. The court retains jurisdiction to modify these arrangements should circumstances change or conditions not be met. As the gavel fell, finalizing the decision, Eli remained frozen in place, overwhelmed by the sudden transformation of his status from hidden survivalist to legally recognized ward with rights and protections he had never expected to receive. Only when timber nudged his hand insistently did reality begin to penetrate his shock. They had won the right to remain together, to keep their home, to exist within the system rather than hiding from it. For the first time in 3 years, Eli had an identity in the world again. No longer an abandoned child surviving in the shadows, but a young person with a legally recognized place in the community, supported by adults who had fought to protect rather than dismantle what he had built. The implications would take time to fully comprehend, but the immediate reality was simple and profound. He and timber were going home. The legacy. 1 year after Judge Marsh's unprecedented ruling, the forest-dwelling Eli had constructed from discarded materials had evolved into something beyond even his ambitious vision. The core structure remained recognizably his creation, maintaining its unique character and ingenious use of salvaged resources, but thoughtful additions had enhanced both functionality and comfort. A proper bedroom addition provided privacy and space as Eli entered his teen years, while expanded solar capacity powered modest conveniences that bridged his wilderness existence with connections to the wider world. The surrounding property had flourished under his careful stewardship, the vegetable garden more productive than ever, fruit trees beginning to bear, and native plants attracting diverse wildlife to their clearing. Timber, now showing slight graying around his muzzle but still powerfully alert, patrolled their expanded territory with the same vigilance that had protected Eli through their years of isolation. The German Shepherd had adapted remarkably well to their new semi-public existence, accepting regular visitors with discriminating calm, while maintaining his fundamental protective nature toward his young master. The most significant change lay not in the physical structure, but in its status within the community. Following a cautiously positive feature in the regional newspaper, titled "The House That Refused Built," their story had captured public imagination, transforming from local curiosity to something approaching legend. Occasional hikers would deliberately detour from marked trails, hoping to glimpse the remarkable dwelling created by the wilderness boy and his loyal dog. Eli, initially uncomfortable with this attention, had gradually developed a measured approach to these encounters, sometimes offering brief tours in exchange for donations to the small foundation Barrett had helped him establish. This organization, officially named Sustainable Futures, provided workshops teaching basic building techniques using salvaged materials to at-risk youth, many of whom found therapeutic value in creating tangible structures from discarded resources. The psychological parallel was never explicitly stated but clearly understood. Both materials and young lives could be reclaimed from apparent worthlessness through proper support and opportunity. Eli's own education had taken an unconventional but highly effective form, combining structured homeschooling for basic academic subjects with practical apprenticeships under local craftspeople who recognized his exceptional aptitude for applied knowledge. His mathematical understanding, developed through years of construction challenges, had flourished when given formal structure, while his natural science knowledge, born from wilderness observation, far exceeded grade-level expectations. His social development progressed more gradually, the years of isolation having created patterns that required patient adaptation, but Maya's steady friendship provided a crucial bridge between his private world and wider human connection. Barrett's guardianship remained the legal foundation of this arrangement, his weekly visits evolving from formal welfare checks to genuine mentorship as he guided Eli through the complexities of navigating a society the boy had once fled. The retired lawyer's advocacy had not ended with the court victory. He continued working to formalize Eli's land ownership through the adverse possession process, systematically documenting improvements and maintenance to establish the legal basis for eventual title transfer when Eli reached adulthood. Most remarkably, the court-mandated inspections and CPS visits had gradually transformed from potential threats to constructive engagements, with several officials becoming genuine advocates for Eli's alternative living arrangement after witnessing its success. What had begun as an exception reluctantly granted had evolved into a case study in reconsidering rigid approaches to child welfare, with social workers occasionally consulting Eli about techniques for connecting with particularly independent or traumatized youth. On a warm summer evening, Eli sat on his expanded deck with Timber resting contentedly beside him, watching the day's final visitors depart down the now-established trail that connected their clearing to the wider world. The German shepherd's head rested heavily on his lap, the dog's steady breathing synchronizing with the gentle forest sounds surrounding them. In the distance, Barrett's car could be seen approaching for his weekly dinner visit, while Maya had promised to arrive later with books borrowed from the county library. The isolation that had once defined their existence had given way to a carefully balanced integration, preserving the independence and self-sufficiency that remained fundamental to Eli's identity, while adding the community connections that enhanced rather than diminished what he had built. As twilight settled over the forest, Eli reflected on the extraordinary journey that had transformed an act of desperate survival into a testament to human resilience and the unbreakable bond between a boy and his dog. What began in abandonment had evolved into belonging. What started as mere shelter had become a home, and what had once existed only in shadows now stood in light, a legacy not just of survival but of genuine thriving against all odds.